Hi, this is Dean Double Agent 18 here with Test Double, and I love promises. That's no secret. But today I came across a really interesting problem that I certainly would not have wanted to use callbacks for, and it was fairly tricky to use promises for. So here is the problem. So imagine that you're writing an API method that will be called, and it's named getSets with AwesomeCount. The way this method works, pretty simple. Given a user ID, you get all sets belonging to that user. You can think of them as sets of media or whatever the user keeps track of in sets. You're going to return those sets, but the service that gives you the sets doesn't include a count of awesomes that are assigned to the sets, and you have to enhance each particular set with a call to fetch its awesomes. So there are two services. Two service calls you need to make. One is get sets by user ID, and it returns a promise for an array of sets. Each set then needs to have its ID passed to get counts. Get counts returns a promise for an object of descriptive information about that set, including a count of awesomes. And so if you've heard of n+1 queries, this is a service-oriented version of that, and we say that we make n+1 service calls where n is the number of sets. So the logic for this, let's imagine that we weren't using promises, that it was just strictly synchronous. You could write a method, getSets with AwesomeCount. It takes a user, retrieves the sets for the given user's ID for each set. So in other words, mapping across the sets. We are getting the counts for it, and then we're enhancing the set with an AwesomeCount pulled off of the return object from getCounts, and then we're returning the set. So in a synchronous version, this would return all of the sets. It would do all of the service calls, and it would block. We don't have that luxury, do we? So we have to start with a promise version. If we had ES7 async, this uses promises under the hoods, but there are a couple of nice keywords. And you notice that if you use these keywords, the difference between the synchronous function and the asynchronous function is really just these keywords, async and await. So look at the first word on the function declaration, async, and look at the two awaits within the method. And what that does is it says this getSets function may return a promise, but we're going to await it. And when you await a promise, you can treat it like a regular value. So unfortunately, there are two things wrong with this. One, ES7 isn't everywhere, so we don't have access to that yet. And number two, there's actually a performance problem here. Can you spot it? It's a bit subtle, but you see how in this loop we are awaiting getCounts. And the problem with that is that we can't retrieve multiple counts simultaneously, right? We have to block until we get the count for the first set, get to the next set, block until we get its count, and so forth. So it has the advantage of looking very much like, and I'm going to switch to the other version, just watch the async and awaits disappear. Right? It looks very much like the synchronous version, but unfortunately we can't use this. And it's not how I solved the problem today with another agent. So what we did started with this. I asked him to review my stuff. And he said, why don't you do something like this? And he was very familiar with the Bluebird library. And the Bluebird library lets you do a couple of things. So we know that on this first line, getSets returns a promise. But it may or may not be a Bluebird promise. We're getting it from a library. So first we cast it to a Bluebird promise. Since we know that this is an array of sets, the Bluebird library exposes a map method directly on it. So we can map across the promise for the array of sets, which was pretty cool. I didn't know you could do that. And then give the map utility or method a function, which can then call getCounts. Now you'll have a promise for counts, but you can turn that in to a promise for the awesome field of the object. I'll show you the object in a second. And enhance the set just by assigning something to it, and then use this promise.props method to essentially await the resolution of the, well, it doesn't actually await, but to return a promise for when the enhanced set is fulfilled. So it's a lot of words. Let's look at what kind of objects we're talking about. So remember, our getSets service is returning us a couple fields, let's say ID and name. And when we use this method, we end up with a field on the object awesomeCount that is a promise for fetching the awesome field asynchronously from the service. So we're taking our original object and creating this hybrid object with some values and some promises. So that's why we use the promise.props method to turn this into, eventually, an object with just the resolved fields. Now, I knew how to do not the Bluebird version, but a vanilla JavaScript version, because I've worked in environments where Bluebird wasn't an option. So what you can do with this set object that's mixed values and promises is you could invert this. You could turn this into a promise for an object of all the values. And this can be more compatible with vanilla.js, as I'll show you in just a second. So see the difference between a enhanced set object that's part values, part promises, and a promise for an object that's only values. So I'll show you in vanilla.js how to create this. It's like this. A little more nested, a little harder to follow the flow. But you get the sets, then you have to chain onto it with a thenable. And for each set, you map it into a promise for the set once it has been enhanced by awesomeCount. So getCounts is asynchronous. When it comes back, you can enhance the object and return it. And so you'll have an array, you'll have a promise for an array of promises for objects. It's a mouthful. And you can hand that back to the caller, and the caller can then await all the promises in the array. Or if you add one little thing to this, pay attention, promise.all, you can then be sure that all of the enhanced sets have returned by the time the caller gets this. So this is where I started with this. Promise.all is available most places that promises are available, including Bluebird. And this certainly works, but it doesn't have quite the same feel, I think, as the Bluebird or the ES7 version. So in my opinion, Bluebird is for the win. Its correspondence with the Synchronous version is 1-to-1, and it doesn't tear apart your flow of code, and it's just pretty awesome. So use Bluebird, use promises, and thanks for watching this.